The captured alien. Zyra's body ached. Cold metal chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles, holding her against the hard stone wall. The air smelled of rust and damp earth. A dim red light flickered in the small, windowless prison cell. She was alone. Her people had lost. Zyra clenched her jaw. She was a warrior of the Veil Empire, trained since childhood to fight. Yet here she was, wounded, weak, and at the mercy of a human. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Humans were monsters. That's what she had been told. That's what she had always believed. They were brutal, merciless creatures who conquered and destroyed everything in their path. They took no prisoners. They showed no mercy. She had seen it herself, and now she was one of their prisoners. Her sharp ears picked up the sound of footsteps. Heavy boots, slow and steady, echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. Zyra tensed. Her heartbeat quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. No matter what they did to her, she would not beg. She would not scream. She would not break. The metal door creaked open. A human stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong. His uniform was dark, decorated with strange symbols she didn't recognize. A scar ran across his left cheek, but his blue eyes were steady, sharp, and unreadable. Zyra glared at him. If this was her executioner, she would meet her end with pride. The human did not speak at first. He simply stood there, studying her, as if she were some strange creature he had never seen before. Finally, he stepped closer and crouched in front of her. "You're awake," he said. His voice was deep, calm, but held no cruelty. Zyra did not answer. She refused to give him the satisfaction. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You don't look so good." She let out a cold laugh. "I wonder why." The human did not react to her sarcasm. Instead, he pulled something from his belt, a small metal container. He pressed a button, and it clicked open, revealing a vial of thick, golden liquid. Zyra's nostrils flared. She knew that smell. Valian healing serum. Her stomach twisted. How did a human have that? Had they stolen it from her people? The human tilted his head. "You recognize this, don't you?" Still, she said nothing. He took out a cloth and poured a small amount of the serum onto it. Then, to her surprise, he reached for her arm, gently. Zyra flinched, but she was too weak to pull away. She expected pain. Instead, there was warmth. The serum seeped into her wound, easing the burning ache. Confusion filled her mind. Why was he healing her? She narrowed her eyes. "What is this? Some kind of human trick?" The human smirked, but it was not a cruel expression. "If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't be wasting good medicine." She frowned, searching his face for deception. She found none. "Who are you?" she asked. "Commander Eric Voss," he said. "And you are Zyra, a lieutenant of the Veil Empire." He knew her name. Zyra's body stiffened. How much did he know? Eric leaned back on his heels. "Your people left you behind." Her breath caught in her throat. "No, that couldn't be true." "You're lying," she spat. Eric's face remained calm. "Am I?" Zyra shook her head. The Veil Empire never abandoned its warriors. They would come for her. They had to. Eric studied her reaction, then sighed. "Believe what you want. But the truth is, I don't want to kill you." She scoffed. "Then what do you want?" He hesitated, then said, "Answers." Zyra let out a bitter laugh. "So that's it. You heal me so I will talk. So I will betray my people." Eric didn't deny it. But he also didn't push her. Instead, he stood up and stepped back toward the door. "Think about it," he said. "You can stay here, waiting for a rescue that isn't coming, or you can help me stop this war." With that, he turned and walked out, locking the door behind him. Zyra sat there, her mind racing. She had expected pain. She had expected torture. But instead, the human had given her kindness. and that terrified her more than anything else. The human's strange kindness. Zyra sat in the cold cell, her mind spinning with questions. She did not understand. She was a warrior of the Veil Empire. She had fought against humans in countless battles. She had seen their cruelty, their destruction. They took no prisoners. And yet, Commander Eric Voss had not harmed her. He had treated her wounds. He had spoken to her, not as an enemy, but as someone who wanted to understand. Why? She clenched her fists. This had to be a trick. Humans were not kind. Humans were not merciful. Her people would come for her. They had to. But as she sat in silence, listening to the distant hum of machinery beyond the prison walls, doubt crept into her mind. Would they? Would her empire really risk lives to save a single captured soldier? She pushed the thought away. She could not afford weakness. Time passed. Hours, maybe longer. The only company she had was the flickering red light above her. Then, footsteps. The door unlocked with a heavy metallic clank, and the human, Eric Voss, stepped inside again. This time, he carried a metal tray. The scent of warm food filled the air, making Zyra's stomach tighten painfully. She had not eaten in days, but she would not beg. She would not accept favors from a human. She turned her head away, pretending not to notice. Eric sighed. "You don't trust me. I get that." She remained silent. He sat down on the floor, a few feet away from her, and placed the tray between them. It contained a bowl of steaming broth, some kind of bread, and a bottle of water. "I know your body needs food to heal. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be offering this," he said simply. Zyra glared at him. "You think I will eat just because you say so?" He shrugged. "No, but I think you will eat because you need to survive." She scoffed. "I would rather starve than accept your poison." Eric chuckled. "Poison? Do you think I went through the trouble of healing your wounds just to kill you with soup?" She hesitated. That did not make sense, but she would not lower her guard. "You are trying to make me trust you," she accused. Eric did not deny it. Instead, he leaned back against the wall and studied her. "I need answers," he said, "but I also don't want to treat you like an animal in a cage." Zyra snorted. "That is exactly what I am right now." His expression darkened slightly. "That's not what I want." She narrowed her eyes. "Then release me." "I can't do that. Then you are no different from the monsters I was told about." Eric exhaled sharply. "You think humans are monsters." She bared her sharp teeth. "I know they are." He was silent for a moment, then leaned forward. "What did they tell you about us?" She hesitated. "That you are ruthless. That you conquer and destroy. That you take what is not yours." Eric nodded slowly. "And what did they tell you about yourselves?" Zyra lifted her chin. "That we are warriors. That we fight with honor." Something flickered in his expression. Doubt, maybe even pity. "And yet," he said, "your people left you behind." Her stomach twisted. She hated that he kept saying that. She hated that a part of her feared it was true. Zyra stared at the food. She would not show weakness. But her body was betraying her. Her muscles were weak, her vision slightly blurred from hunger. Eric must have noticed. He picked up the bowl, scooped some broth with a spoon, and took a slow sip. "No poison," he said. Zyra clenched her jaw. He was patient, too patient. Slowly, she reached out and took the water bottle. She opened it carefully, sniffing for any unusual scent. Nothing. Just water. She took a small sip. It was cold and refreshing. Eric didn't react. He simply sat there, watching, but not pressuring her. After another long moment, she picked up the spoon and took a single sip of the broth. Warm, savory. She hated how good it tasted. Eric didn't smirk or say anything arrogant. He simply let her eat. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, she placed the empty bowl down. Eric folded his arms. See, not everything humans do is evil. Zyra narrowed her eyes. You think a few kind acts will make me trust you? No, he said honestly. But it's a start. She frowned. He was different from the other humans she had faced on the battlefield. They had been violent, ruthless, but he was something else. And that made him dangerous. Eric stood up and walked to the door. Before he left, he glanced back. Get some rest, Zyra. We'll talk more later. The door shut behind him. Zyra sat in the dim cell, staring at the empty tray. She had expected cruelty. She had expected pain. But instead, he had given her food, warmth, and something she had never felt before: doubt. For the first time in her life, she wondered, what if everything she had been told about humans was wrong? A dangerous deal. Zyra did not sleep that night. She sat in the corner of her cell, watching the flickering red light on the ceiling, her mind a battlefield of doubt and defiance. She hated that the human had been kind to her. Kindness was a weakness, and yet that small act of mercy had shaken her more than any torture ever could. Her people had always told her that humans were monsters, a cruel and brutal race. But Eric Voss had healed her. He had fed her, and worst of all, he had spoken to her as if she were not his enemy, but something else entirely. Something closer to an equal. She did not know how to feel about that. Her stomach, full for the first time in days, made her feel even more restless. If her empire had truly abandoned her, if Eric was telling the truth, then what was she now? A traitor, a prisoner, or something worse? The door to her cell unlocked. Her body tensed as Eric stepped inside, hands in his pockets. He had changed out of his uniform, now wearing a dark, fitted shirt and cargo pants. He looked more relaxed, more human. Zyra hated that it made him seem less like an enemy. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down in front of her, his blue eyes calm but searching. I have a deal for you, he said. Zyra crossed her arms. I'm not interested. You haven't even heard it yet. I don't need to. Eric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You want to get out of this cell, don't you? Zyra bared her teeth in a humorless smile. Obviously. Then work with me. She scoffed. Why would I ever help a human? Eric exhaled, shaking his head. This war, it's a waste of lives. I don't think you want to die here, Zyra. And I don't think you want more of your people to die, either. Zyra stiffened. He was too perceptive. She had seen it firsthand, how war had drained both sides, how bodies littered the battlefield, how honor meant nothing when you were just another corpse in the dirt. But still, she would not betray her people. She lifted her chin. You assume too much. My empire will come for me. Eric's jaw tightened. You keep telling yourself that. Zyra forced a smirk. You sound bitter, Commander. Are you upset that I won't play your little game? Eric leaned back, tilting his head as he studied her. No, just disappointed. Something in his tone made her stomach twist. What do you want from me? She asked. Information. Zyra laughed, sharp and cold. So that's what this kindness is for. You want me to give you secrets? No, Eric said, surprising her. I don't need secrets. I need the truth. She narrowed her eyes. The truth. Eric tapped his fingers against the metal table between them. Your empire is losing. Zyra's breath caught for half a second. No, that couldn't be right. Could it? Eric watched her reaction carefully. You know I'm right. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Our intel shows that your leaders are desperate, Eric continued. They're using soldiers like you as pawns. They don't care if you live or die. That's why they haven't come for you. You're expendable to them. Zyra clenched her fists. You don't know anything. Don't I? Eric's voice was quiet, but firm. Tell me this, Zyra. How many missions have you been on where your commander sent you in without backup, without escape plans? She flinched. Too many. You think they see you as a warrior, Eric said. But to them, you're just another tool. Replaceable. Zyra's breathing was uneven now. He was lying. He had to be. But deep inside, in the place she didn't want to acknowledge, a part of her knew he was telling the truth. Eric sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I don't want you to betray your people, but I do want you to think. Really think. Are they worth dying for if they don't care whether you live? Zyra forced a glare, but her resolve was cracking. She had been fighting for her empire for years. She had followed orders without question. She had trusted her leaders, her commanders. But where were they now? She was here, alone, and only the human was talking to her like she mattered. She hated it, but she also couldn't ignore it. Finally, she spoke. What do you want in return for my freedom? Eric smirked slightly. That's more like it. She frowned. I didn't say I agreed. I know. But you're considering it, he said, standing up. And that's a start. Zyra exhaled sharply, hating the truth in his words. Eric walked toward the door, but hesitated before leaving. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. Think about what you really want, Zyra. Then he left, locking the door behind him. Zyra sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been. Her mind was a storm. She had spent her whole life believing humans were the enemy. But now, sitting in this cell, she realized something far more terrifying. Maybe her true enemy was the empire she had fought so hard to protect. An unlikely bond. Zyra didn't sleep. Again. Her body ached from exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. Thoughts tangled together like a war zone inside her head. Could Eric be telling the truth? No, he was the enemy. He was manipulating her. That's what humans did. And yet, she kept remembering his voice. The way he spoke, the way he didn't demand answers from her. He didn't act like a conqueror, like a monster. That made him even more dangerous. Zyra had been trained to resist pain, to fight against cruelty. But Eric didn't use pain or cruelty. He used patience. He used logic. And that was starting to crack the armor around her mind. Her empire would come for her, wouldn't they? She exhaled, gripping her knees, eyes locked on the cold metal floor of her cell. But they hadn't come yet. And deep inside, a terrible, quiet voice whispered, maybe they never will. The next morning, Eric returned. She was ready for him this time. He walked in with his usual calm, carrying another tray of food. You're stubborn, he said, placing the tray down between them. Zyra scoffed. You sound surprised. He smirked. Not at all. She watched him carefully. He didn't act like a captor. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at her like she was some helpless creature trapped in a cage. He sat down in the same chair as before, elbows resting on his knees, watching her with those sharp blue eyes. The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Finally, Zyra broke it. You're wasting your time. I won't help you. Eric sighed. Maybe. But you're still thinking about it, aren't you? She hated how easily he saw through her. You assume too much, she said. He tilted his head. Do I? She clenched her jaw, refusing to answer. Eric leaned back. Let me ask you something, Zyra. Before you were captured, what was your mission? Zyra's muscles tensed. She knew this was a trap. If she answered, she would be giving him information. But something about the way he asked. He wasn't trying to interrogate her. He was trying to understand her. After a long silence, she spoke. I was ordered to attack your colony, to retrieve something. What? She hesitated, then muttered, I don't know. Eric's eyes darkened. You mean your commander sent you on a mission without telling you why? She lifted her chin. I did not question my orders. He let out a humorless laugh. And that doesn't bother you? No, she wanted to say. But that would be a lie. It did bother her. She had been thrown into battle again and again, never questioning why. Never questioning if it was right. Zara turned her gaze away. It is not my place to ask questions. Eric sighed and leaned forward. Maybe it should be. She swallowed, her throat dry. Another long silence filled the room. Then suddenly, Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and a soft holographic projection appeared in the air. Zara's heart nearly stopped. It was a battlefield. Flashes of energy weapons, smoke rising from the ground. And among the chaos, Valian warriors, her own people, lying dead in the dirt, her breath caught in her throat. "What is this?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "This was taken 2 days ago," Eric said. "Another battle. Another loss for your empire." Zara stared at the images, her body frozen. Her people, losing. Her empire was supposed to be invincible. She felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. She shook her head. This could be fake. Eric's voice was quiet, but firm. "It's not." Zara clenched her fists. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to see the truth." She exhaled shakily. "Why do you care?" Eric was silent for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "Because I don't want to fight you." Zara snapped her gaze to him, searching for mockery, for deception. She found none. She stared at him. "You think one act of kindness will make me betray my people?" Eric shook his head. "No. But I think you're starting to see that maybe your people have already betrayed you." Her breath hitched. For the first time, she had no response. The following nights were different. Zara didn't realize it at first, but something between them had shifted. She still didn't trust him. Not fully, but she was no longer fighting just to resist him. They talked more. Not about war, not about strategies, but about each other. One night, Eric told her about his home planet, how he had once wanted to be an explorer, not a soldier. She listened. Another night, she told him about her training as a child, how she had been forced to fight at the age of 6, how she had never known anything else. He listened. The war was still there, the blood, the losses, the loyalty to their sides. But in that small prison cell, in the quiet moments, they were just two warriors who had seen too much, and that terrified her more than anything. Because for the first time, Zara didn't just see him as an enemy. She saw him as something more. She had expected pain, torture, death. Instead, he had given her something she never thought she would have. Understanding. Maybe even a choice. And choices were dangerous. Because now, she had to decide where she truly belonged. Betrayed by her own. Zara no longer knew what she was fighting for. For days, she had resisted. For days, she had convinced herself that she was a loyal soldier of the Vale Empire, that her people would never abandon her. But as she sat in that cold, silent cell, the weight of doubt pressed on her chest, like a crushing force. Eric hadn't spoken to her in 2 days. Not since their last conversation. Not since she had admitted, if only to herself, that everything she had believed might have been a lie. She should have been relieved at his absence. It should have made it easier to hold on to her hatred. But instead, she found herself restless, uneasy, her mind swirling with questions. And then, something changed. It was late in the cycle when Zara heard voices outside her cell. She tensed. Not Eric's voice. Other humans. Soldiers. Their tones were sharp, urgent. She shifted closer to the door, straining to hear. The general wants her executed. Zara's heart stopped. Can't do that without Voss's approval. Voss is too soft. If we wait, we might lose our chance. The higher-ups don't want a prisoner. They want a message. A heavy silence. Then a quiet, bitter voice. When? Soon, before Voss can stop it. The footsteps faded. Zara sat frozen, her breath shallow. Executed. They were planning to kill her. Panic flashed through her, but she shoved it down. Fear would not save her. She needed to think. Voss didn't know. He had been protecting her, But he couldn't protect her from his own people if they moved against him. She pressed her back against the cold metal wall, closing her eyes. She had been a fool. For a moment, just a moment, she had allowed herself to believe that this was different. That maybe Eric Voss was different. That maybe she wasn't just a pawn. But she was. To the humans, she was just an enemy, a tool, a liability. And to her own empire. Zara swallowed hard. Would they really come for her? Would they risk a rescue mission for a single captured warrior? The whispers of doubt had been growing for days. Now they screamed inside her mind. Her people weren't coming. She was truly alone. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. No, she would not let them decide her fate. If the humans planned to execute her, she would escape. If her empire had abandoned her, she would find a new path. But she needed to act fast. And for that, she needed Voss. The next morning, when the door to her cell opened, Zara was ready. Eric stepped inside, his face unreadable. "You haven't eaten," he said, placing a tray down. Zara didn't respond. She just stared at him. Something in her expression made him frown. He pulled out the chair and sat down, watching her closely. "What's wrong?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a quiet, measured voice, she said, "They're going to kill me." Eric's body went completely still. She saw it then. The flicker of shock in his eyes. He hadn't known. Zara leaned forward, keeping her voice low, controlled. "Your men. They're planning to execute me before you can stop them." A muscle in Eric's jaw twitched. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he exhaled. His hands curled into fists, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tight with anger. "They wouldn't dare. They already have." His nostrils flared as he stood up, pacing. Zara watched him carefully, her heartbeat steady but fast. This was the moment. This was the moment that would decide if she lived or died. Finally, Eric turned back to her, his blue eyes burning with something fierce. "No one is touching you," he said. Zara tilted her head. "You sound sure of that." "I am." She let out a slow breath. "Then prove it." Eric met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. He nodded once. Then, without another word, he left the cell, locking the door behind him. Zara sat in the silence, her pulse pounding. Now it was a waiting game. Hours passed. Then, the alarms blared. Zara's head snapped up. Something was happening. Footsteps, shouting. Then, gunfire. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She lunged to her feet just as the door to her cell burst open. Eric stood there, weapon in hand. His uniform was slightly torn, his breathing heavy. "Move," he ordered. Zara hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. "What did you do?" He gave her a sharp look. "I made a choice. Now let's go before I start regretting it." Zara's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. This human was mad. But for the first time since her capture, she had hope. And she wasn't going to waste it. Choosing a side. The sirens howled through the base like a dying beast, the red emergency lights flashing across the cold steel walls. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, sharp and brutal. Zara's muscles coiled, her instincts screaming at her to move, to fight. This was her moment. Eric stood in the doorway, his stance firm, a pulse rifle in his hands. His uniform was stained with ash, a fresh cut above his brow. He looked at her, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a warrior standing beside him. "Are you coming or not?" he asked. For a fraction of a second, Zara hesitated. This was it, the moment she chose. She could stay here, refuse to move, let the humans kill her, die a loyal soldier of the Veil Empire. Or she could escape, fight, survive. She met Eric's gaze and stepped forward. "Lead the way, human." He smirked, turning on his heel. "Try to keep up, alien." Then they ran. The hallways were chaos. Smoke from plasma blasts filled the air, stinging Zyra's eyes. The sharp scent of burned metal clung to everything. The base was under attack, but not by humans. Her stomach twisted as she saw the insignia on the dead bodies of fallen soldiers. Valian troops, her own people. Eric pulled her into cover as another explosion rocked the corridor. "Looks like your empire finally decided you were worth killing after all," he muttered. Zyra gritted her teeth. Her people hadn't come to rescue her. They had come to silence her. She had been marked for death. Something inside her snapped. She had spent her whole life fighting for the Veil Empire. She had been willing to die for it. But now, her own leaders had sent an execution squad instead of a rescue team. And suddenly, everything Eric had told her made sense. Her people didn't care about her. She had never been anything more than a pawn to them. Eric nudged her, his voice low but urgent. "You with me?" Zyra inhaled sharply, pushing her rage deep down. There was no time to mourn her old loyalty. She gripped the pulse rifle Eric had handed her and nodded. "Let's move." The battlefield was brutal. The Valian strike team moved like shadows, cutting through human defenses with terrifying efficiency. Eric's own soldiers were fighting desperately to hold them off, but it was clear they were losing. Zyra took cover behind a fallen steel beam, firing off 2 precise shots. A Valian soldier dropped, a hole burned clean through his armor. Her first kill for the humans. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't let herself feel it. She had no time for doubt anymore. Eric crouched beside her, reloading his weapon. "We need to get to the hangar. If we can steal a ship, we can get off this rock." She nodded. "How many men do you have left?" His jaw tightened. "Not enough." Zyra glanced at the bodies around them, both human and Valian. This war wasn't clean. There was no honor here, only death. She wasn't going to die for either side. A deep roar thundered through the sky. The ground beneath them trembled as a Valian warship descended above the base, its cannons glowing hot, ready to wipe out everything in sight. Eric cursed. "They're going to level the place." Zyra's mind raced. They weren't just here for her anymore. Her empire had decided to eliminate every last human in this base. They weren't taking prisoners. They were making sure that no one, not even their own people, could tell the truth. She had seconds to decide. She turned to Eric. "I can stop them." His head snapped toward her. "What?" Zyra's grip tightened around her rifle. "I know how their comms work. Their frequencies. I can override their signals and send a false order." Eric frowned. "And you know this." "How?" Her expression darkened. "Because I've done it before." She had always followed orders. Now she was about to break them. Eric stared at her, searching her face for any sign of deception. Then, with a sharp nod, he grabbed her wrist. "Let's do it." They moved fast, cutting through the base like a storm. Eric's remaining soldiers provided cover as Zyra and Eric sprinted toward the command center. Zyra's heart pounded as she accessed the terminal. Her fingers flew over the controls, bypassing layers of security codes she had once memorized as a soldier. She found the comm override frequency. Her pulse raced. If she did this, there was no turning back. She inhaled sharply and spoke into the mic. "This is Strike Leader Valkis. The target has been neutralized. Mission complete. Pull back." Silence. Then, a robotic acknowledgement tone. Zyra's stomach clenched as she watched the enemy ship slowly power down its weapons. Then, just like that, they retreated. Eric let out a breath. "You did it." She stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly. She had just saved the lives of humans. She had just betrayed her empire. Eric placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "We need to get out of here." Zyra nodded, forcing herself to move. They sprinted through the burning halls toward the hangar. A few of Eric's men had made it. They fought their way to a small, sleek human gunship. Zyra slid into the co-pilot's seat, her hands moving instinctively over the controls. She was escaping with them. She had made her choice. The hangar doors opened, and the ship blasted off into the sky, leaving the burning base and her past behind. Zara exhaled, staring at the shrinking battlefield below. She was no longer a soldier of the Veil Empire. She was something else now. And for the first time in her life, she was free. A new future. The stolen human gunship soared through the dark void of space, breaking free from the war-torn planet below. The red glow of fire and destruction flickered in the distance, growing smaller and smaller as they climbed higher. Zara sat in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers gripping the console as she tried to steady her breathing. She had done it. She had escaped. But as the reality of it all settled into her bones, one terrifying question remained. What now? The cockpit was silent. Eric sat in the pilot's chair, hands steady on the controls, eyes locked on the navigation screen. His soldiers, the few who had survived, were strapped into the back of the ship, their faces grim, exhausted. They had lost their base. They had lost their people. But they were still alive. And Zara had nowhere left to go. She stared at the stars outside the window, her chest tight. For so long, she had believed she would die for the Veil Empire. It had been her purpose, her identity. But now she was nothing. A traitor. An exile. And yet, she was free. That thought scared her more than anything. Eric glanced at her. You okay? Zara let out a sharp laugh. You really think I'm okay? He exhaled. Fair point. Silence. Then he leaned back in his seat, studying her. You don't have to stay with us. She turned to him, eyes narrowing. What? Eric shrugged. We're heading back to human space. Once we get there, you're free to go. No one's forcing you to stay. Zara's stomach twisted. Free to go. To where? Her people would never take her back. Not after what she had done. The Veil Empire would hunt her down if they ever found her. And the humans, even if Eric didn't see her as an enemy, his people might. Zara crossed her arms. So what? You'll just drop me off on some random planet and wish me luck. Eric's lips twitched. I mean, if that's what you want. She stared at him, her thoughts a tangled mess. She should have been angry. She should have been looking for a way to regain her honor, to reclaim her place in the Empire. But all she felt was tired. Tired of fighting for a cause that saw her as disposable. Tired of obeying orders from leaders who had never cared if she lived or died. For the first time in her life, she had no master. No orders. The only person who had fought for her, the only person who had given her a choice, was sitting beside her, flying her to freedom. Her throat tightened. What if I don't know where to go? She admitted quietly. Eric's hands relaxed on the controls. You figure it out, he said. One step at a time. Zara exhaled. That's not how it works for my people. Eric gave her a knowing look. You're not your people anymore. The words struck deep. She should have been furious. But instead, she felt relief. Hours later, the ship docked at a remote human outpost. The surviving soldiers disembarked, some shooting wary glances at Zara, but saying nothing. She could tell they didn't trust her. And why would they? She had been their enemy just days ago. Eric lingered by the ship's ramp, waiting as Zara took slow steps forward. The dusty air of the outpost filled her lungs. The lights of human civilization blinked in the distance. It was strange. All her life, she had been told that humans were monsters. Now she was standing among them. And they weren't the ones who had betrayed her. Zara turned to Eric. So, she said, crossing her arms. What happens now? Eric smirked. That depends on you. She scoffed. That's not an answer. No, it's not, he admitted. But it's the truth. Zara rolled her eyes, but for the first time in days, she felt the ghost of a real smile pulling at her lips. Eric studied her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data chip. He tossed it to her. She caught it effortlessly. "What's this?" she asked. "Coordinates," Eric said. "To a place where people like you, people with nowhere to go, can start over." Zaira stared at him. "And why would you help me?" Eric shrugged. "Call it a bad habit," she huffed. "Or maybe you just like trouble." His grin widened. "That too." She looked down at the chip, turning it over in her fingers. She didn't know if she could trust this, if she could trust him. But then again, she had already made one impossible choice. Maybe it was time to make another. Zaira met Eric's gaze. "Fine. I'll take a look." He nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. And with that, Zaira took her first step into a future she had never planned for. A future of her own making. Epilogue. The beginning of something more. As Zaira walked away, Eric watched her go, something unreadable in his expression. One of his men approached him. "You sure about this, Commander? She's still an alien. She could turn on us." Eric smirked, shaking his head. "No." He glanced toward Zaira one last time. "She's not one of them anymore." Then he turned and followed his crew into the outpost, disappearing into the crowd. And Zaira, for the first time in her life, walked forward with no chains, no orders, only possibility.